In this episode of Space Minds, host Mike Gruss is joined by SpaceNews journalists Jason Rainbow, Sandra Erwin, Jeff Foust and Debra Werner for a wide-ranging conversation on the space stories that will define the year ahead. But first, a word from our sponsor, Voyager Technologies. The future of commercial space is here, a space station designed from day one to support science, national security, commercial R&D, and long-duration human presence without compromise. Led by Voyager Technologies, Starlab will provide a seamless transition from the ISS into the new commercial era.
Hi, everyone. My name is Mike Gruss, and I'm the Chief Content and Strategy Officer at SpaceNews. First thing, I'd like to start today by thanking you for subscribing. Your support means a lot to us. I'd also like to welcome you to our first subscriber-only online event. We're hoping to have these types of events on a somewhat regular basis, and we hope this is fun and want to do it again. But to kick things off today, I'd like to introduce our reporters. We have Jeff Foust, who covers civil space, Sandra Erwin, who covers military space, Jason Rainbow, who covers satellite communications and industry, and Debra Werner, who covers all of it for us. We're going to get to a whole host of questions today, and there were a lot of them. But I wanted to get going with a bit of a lightning round by asking our team for one thing they're going to be watching for in the first half of 2026. Could be a program, it could be a trend, it could be a person. But let's start there. So, Jason, why don't you kick it off?
Sure, yeah. Well, one of the main things I'll be watching out for is the continued ramp up of Amazon's LEO broadband constellation, which is due to go live in the coming months, and would mean that the LEO broadband market would become a true two-player contest for the first time, which obviously has far-reaching implications for the entire industry.
Great. We'll be watching that one closely. Sandra.
Hello, Mike, and hello to all of our viewers. I think the primary thing that I'll be watching out is what the Trump administration will request for funding for the Space Force in 2027. Obviously, we're still in limbo concerning 2026 funding. However, the administration will be expected to release a request for 2027 along with a 5-year projection, which last year they did not provide. So I think that's going to be a really key thing to watch for, to get some clues as to what programs are going to be winners, losers, where things are. So that would be a major point for me going forward in the new year.
Yeah, and we heard a lot this year from Space Force leadership saying they needed more money. Debra, how about one thing you'll be watching this year in the first half of the year?
One thing that I noticed when we were talking to people earlier this week at the Icon Awards was the applications of artificial intelligence are accelerating. Spacecraft, someday we'll stop talking about it. It will be like spacecraft having propulsion. But for right now, it's really interesting to see how they are using deep learning, for example, to react to their surroundings, to notify other spacecraft in a swarm, to look at something. They're not just following instructions or a map created on the ground. Yeah. So I'll be watching that.
Yeah, that'll be a lot of fun to watch. And I would just plug we have an AI newsletter that comes out every Thursday, and folks can follow along there. Jeff, how about you? What's one item or program or person you'll be watching first half of 26?
Yeah, I think the big thing to look for in early 2026 is what NASA looks like and what NASA does with Jared Isaacman finally installed as administrator. We saw from the hearing this week that it looks like he is on a fast track to confirmation. A vote by the committee on Monday, perhaps the full Senate later in the week or next week. So he will finally be in office. And what will he do differently given all of the pressure on the agency to accelerate the Artemis program and get humans back on the moon before China gets there? And the other question will be, what will he be able to do given the limitations that may be placed on him by both the administration and by Congress?
Yeah, and like that's a great segue, Jeff, because one of the questions we got earlier this week came from I believe Del Uthman, and he said, "How impactful do you expect Jared Isaacman to be as a NASA administrator, and do you expect restructuring of the Artemis program and partial restoration of funding for science missions?"
Yeah, I mean that again, that's going to be in part what Isaacman tries to do, and also what Congress funds or allows him to do through legislation. In terms of funding for science missions, I think we've seen in both the House and Senate appropriations bills that are pending that they have restored in part or entirely the funding that was set aside or was tried to be cut by the administration for science programs. So I expect a lot of that to be restored. But there'll also be a 2027 budget request that will come out early next year, and we'll see if the administration tries to cut science once again. Then, in terms of what Isaacman does with NASA, I think one of the big questions will be what happens to Artemis in terms of the lunar lander program, in terms of other elements of that, again, getting to that issue of trying to accelerate Artemis, try and bring forward a lunar landing. At the hearing earlier this week, he was asked by one of the senators about the proposal to reopen the Artemis lunar lander contracts to competition. And he sort of dodged the question a little bit, suggested that SpaceX and Blue Origin, which are the companies that currently have contracts, are in effect already competing with one another for the ability to do that first. However, both companies submitted proposals to accelerate those plans, and whether Isaacman will pick up those plans or ask them to do something else or take another turn entirely remains to be seen. But that's going to be a key issue to watch next year.
Yep. It'll be a lot of fun. We got a question here from Stephen Jordan Tomaszewski. He said, "What do you see as the biggest space supply chain challenge? What is stopping the space industry from rapidly scaling up manufacturing and production of satellites and launch systems?" And I think that's a question anyone can answer. But Jason, let's start with you there. I know you've watched particularly satellite manufacturing pretty closely. What do you see as the big supply chain challenge for this year?
Sure, yeah. Yeah, well, certainly something I'm always hearing at industry conferences is talent. The space industry is expanding and you need the workforce there to support that. Space has that cool factor, which helps attract people, but we're not only talking about countries versus other countries. So there is competition which we've written about within the US. The states are kind of trying to outdo each other to encourage people to set up shop there. So attracting and retaining talent is a big one. For materials, there are a number of choke points that propulsion, radiation hardened electronics, laser communications. I think manufacturers have learnt from the supply chain disruption of COVID-19. They're stockpiling a lot more. They're bringing more production in-house, which helps. But yeah, and Deborah, you wrote about the supply chain issue recently, right?
I have, and I hear it wherever I go and talk to people. I hear about solar cells, their struggles to find the power sources that they need. And also somebody told me recently about trouble getting the appropriate cables. I mean, really low, relatively low tech stuff, but space doesn't have the quantities that it needs to compete with an automotive company to get to become a priority. And so what I notice is people are using the money that they're acquiring through private equity or an IPO to buy some of these suppliers to bring on board what they need.
Yeah. Yeah.
I can also add a little tidbit on that topic. We just recently saw the annual report from a government commission that looks at US-China economic developments and competition, and they had a hearing. And this idea that the US is ahead of China in space technology, however, scaling systems continues to be very difficult. And that's something that they believe China is really getting ahead of us as far as being able to mass produce and scale. And so I think that is all these items that Jason and Deborah identified are part of the mix. And so I think it's just going to be a matter of, can the US ramp up the industrial base so that it can scale to the degree that is needed for military, commercial, and everybody that has requirements today.
Yeah. We got a good question here from Scott Curry at Black Sky. Sandra, maybe this one is for you, but the question is, international governments are outpacing the US government by establishing early contracts with US commercial companies to provide sovereign space and ground systems to support their security industrial goals. How can the US government take better advantage of US commercial space capabilities to drive down costs and deliver new capabilities to the government far faster than historical preference to build bespoke systems exclusively for the government and its allies? And we heard Major General Stephen Purdy talk about this week again at the Icon Awards. It's a drum he's been beating. It's a drum that the Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth has been talking about. We've heard it all year. What do you see happening on this front?
I don't know that we're going to see a whole lot of change. I think what we see happening in the industry, them going to the international market for government customers, makes more sense from the perspective that they can go to these governments, and these governments have flexibility to buy commercial, and they can get contracts relatively quickly. Whereas in the US government, you still have a situation where the National Reconnaissance Office has its own capability, the government has its own capability, and so the industry has to compete head to head with that. And so it remains very difficult, I think, until the government decides that maybe they want to put more funding into commercial and perhaps not have so much dependence on government-owned systems. I think that challenge for the industry will continue. And we saw that commercial EO, electro-optical imaging contracts by the NRO have been curtailed. A very difficult problem for the industry. They're trying to get the funding restored through congressional channels. But I think Scott's question is something that the industry has been wrestling for a long time, and they just have to look for the government to perhaps change the policy at some point, is less bespoke, less government-owned, and more commercial. So I don't know that that's going to change in the near term.
Yeah, or change quickly. Go ahead, Deborah.
So one thing that's been interesting to me for my whole career is when people announce that they're going to have a commercial, US government say we're going to have a commercial first policy, because it's already the official policy. It may not be implemented, but it is the official policy.
That is exactly right. And I think what happens is that is a policy, but it's not what you see in the budget. And I think that's a problem for the industry.
We have a similar question here, or related, which is, what patterns do you observe in nations starting or growing their own space agencies or in space industries? I think this is particularly relevant after what we saw last month with the ministerial in Bremen for the European Space Agency. How much and what parts of the value chain do you think they'll want to have in country? I think anyone on the panel could probably talk about this. Jeff, do you want to kick it off, and then maybe Sandra or Deborah go from there? Jason, feel free to chime in. Anyone?
Yeah. I'll start off here. I don't know if there's any sort of one single pattern or trend that countries follow. For many years, sort of, if a country was just starting to get into space, the milestone was to get a satellite of their own into space. That was sort of something that was achievable on budgets for smaller countries. And it was also an opportunity for them to leverage capabilities from other countries or other companies that would help them develop that satellite. Sometimes that would be as simple as a CubeSat, perhaps with parts procured from various suppliers and then built by students or young engineers in the country. Sometimes it would be a little bit more sophisticated, maybe an Earth imaging satellite that they would partner with a company like Surrey Satellite in the UK to help develop. In terms of sort of capturing the value chain, I think as countries start to move beyond sort of that milestone of having a single satellite, they start to think about what capabilities do they want and what areas do they want to specialize in. In the case of Europe, there are opportunities for countries to have their companies specialize in a particular technology or particular area, and then leverage contracts that ESA then distributes through the funding its member states kick in, particularly through the geo-return mechanism, where countries get back contracts based on the amount of money they kick in. So if you specialize in a particular area, you can fund some programs, you can get that money back to the companies in your country to support a particular subsystem or a particular technology that might be used on various programs.
And,
I
and
can
think
add, yeah.
real quickly, I would just say, and I think what we've been writing about too is that these motivations aren't the same too. That every country has different motivations for what they want, for the capabilities they want to add, and why they want to add them. Sandra, go ahead.
Yeah, I think to just pile on to what Jeff said, there's security, there's industrial competitiveness, there's a desire to control critical infrastructure. I think all those are driving forces. I think you see the trend, maybe you can call it militarization of dual use, which we're seeing, and the fact that US companies are branching out to try to tap into this market. As far as the applications, obviously communications, navigation, Earth observation, space situational awareness, those are all areas where you see more interest in sovereign capabilities. I mean, it seems pretty remarkable how many, especially in Earth observation, how many companies we've seen sign major deals. Electro-optical imaging, formerly Maxar, now Vantor. They have a huge international office. ISI, the synthetic aperture radar company, they've signed a number of international deals. I mean, you can go down the line, and it's a trend that I think may be accelerating going forward.
I'll just add spaceports. I'm seeing a lot of early activity. There's some that aren't public yet, but the idea of a lot of congestion at the Cape, and just there seems to be an appetite for more launch sites. And so where the country's location makes sense, I'm seeing them thinking about that infrastructure, but then using that as a focal point to add a space cluster, get more space-related businesses, and then build your startup venture scene around that, which I thought was quite interesting.
I wanted to switch to a coverage question here. We have a couple of those from our readers, and I appreciate this one's from Brian Lustig, who I know most of the panel is familiar with. He writes, given the likely growth in space tech startups and other new entrants in 2026, how do you expect that to guide editorial coverage next year? Do you expect more column inches for startups and emerging brands, or do you anticipate a higher bar for these types of companies to cut through the noise? Jason, you want to start there, or Deborah, either one?
It's something we take very seriously, and it's something we're already dealing with. There's no shortage of moonshot ventures and startups that are just PowerPoint slides out there. We all get an insane amount of press releases every day. So there's already a lot of noise. And generally we only cover things where we feel we can add value and report on the news. We don't just report on the news, we provide analysis and forward-looking insights, and that's only going to increase next year as we develop our business intelligence offerings. So there can be a bar. We have to make a call about how real a company or story is. Sometimes that's revenues, funding, or something else that's concrete, because we do have to be mindful about where we invest our time and resources. But yeah, as that noise grows, I don't think it's always a case of raising that bar. There are other ways of addressing this. For instance, if there's a surge of companies, startups that are all chasing maybe like a single opportunity, rather than doing super deep dives into every single one of those, you can group them up and then go into how they differ from each other. And I think sometimes that can be more helpful for helping a reader get their head about just where this market is moving.
I agree. And I'll just add to that, fortunately, we don't have to worry so much about column inches anymore. So we do have the capacity to write about a lot of different companies. But just like Jason said, it takes more for them to rise to our attention. There was a time when I could write about it felt like I could write about every single new startup in the US and every company launching a CubeSat. That's no longer the case.
Yeah. Yeah.
I have another sort of additional comment to that on that topic, which goes back to the General Purdy speech on Tuesday at the Space News Awards, talking about the pace of innovation. He has actually told all the program managers in the Space Force to get out and see what's going on in the industry. So I think they kind of look upon the media for us to kind of tell them the stories of what's happening in some of these companies, because they would never be able to keep up. So I think that kind of puts us in a role of, trying to screen what's happening in the market and provide at least, be able to share the most important developments, because the government does rely on organizations, media organizations like us to provide that information.
I have a question here for Jeff, which is, do you have an expected timeline for when the Lunar Terrain Vehicle contract is going to be issued?
That's a timely question, because I was actually talking just yesterday to a couple of the companies involved in that program. Just for a little background, the Lunar Terrain Vehicle program is a NASA effort to develop a lunar rover for future Artemis missions, a 21st century version of the rover that was used on the later Apollo missions is probably the best way to describe it. Like so many other things NASA's doing, they're doing the LTV program as a service. They won't buy the rover itself. Rather, they will support development of the rover and then basically rent that rover when they need it on Artemis missions. And the company or companies that develop those rovers can then offer them for others during the most of the year when there aren't astronauts on the moon, since these can be remotely operated. NASA selected 3 companies that supported them through the early phase of development: Astrolab, Intuitive Machines, and Lunar Outpost. They all submitted final proposals earlier this year for the next phase of the program. And the best estimate from the people I've talked with is they are at least hoping that later this month, NASA will make an award. The question will be, will they make one award, or will they make 2 awards, or will they make maybe 1.5? That is, pick one company for full development and then take a second company and fund at least development through a next phase, like a critical design review sort of phase. And the issue is, NASA, through the services approach, has typically selected a couple of companies: Commercial Cargo, Commercial Crew, Lunar Lander, all examples of those. And the experience has shown that it's good to have at least 2 companies involved in case one falters. Boeing with Starliner, for example, or with spacesuits, Collins Aerospace had one of the spacesuit awards and it dropped out. And so Axiom is the one company left still working on spacesuits. So that remains to be seen what approach they take. That'll depend also on budgets, which we may not have resolution by this month. But I think the industry at least is hoping to get some clarity and maybe an award or 2 later this month.
Well, all right, great. One item we touched on this week in our Editor's Choice newsletter is this idea of momentum behind some of Jeff Bezos's space companies right now. Particularly last month, there were a series of announcements, big big milestones reached. And we have a couple questions related to that. One says, I feel the consensus view in the space community has been that Blue Origin has this potential, but hasn't been able to put it together to yet. Are we to trust this new momentum? Should we look to their launch cadence to validate? And one other question that said, what's the status of Blue Origin Dave Limp's trial balloon of a Blue Moon MK1.5 and an accelerated return to the lunar surface? Has NASA shown any interest in this? So I think there's a lot to tackle there, but Jeff, maybe you want to start and anyone else can chime in, but what do we make of Blue Origin's last month and also Jeff Bezos' space companies at large?
Yeah. I'll start maybe with the second part of that first involving Blue Moon. This gets back to the request by NASA to both Blue Origin and SpaceX to develop alternatives to accelerate a crewed lunar landing. And Blue Origin has pitched a proposal. They haven't really given any details about it, but it would involve what they call the Mark I version of their Blue Moon lander, which is a robotic lander. Not designed to carry people. The Mark II version is the one that's designed to carry people, but they have proposed an architecture that might combine elements of both the Mark I and the Mark II landers to provide that accelerated return. So that proposal's into NASA. What they decide to do with it, what Jared Isaacman decides to do with it, obviously we'll see probably in the coming weeks. Just in terms of Blue Origin in general, I think, Dave Limp has really pushed the company to go faster. Obviously, Jeff Bezos wants the company to go faster. The company is about 25 years old. A lot of people don't realize that, but it started around, early 2000s, and they had just their first orbital launches this year. But I think they see the need to go faster. We'll see how quickly they can ramp up the launch cadence of New Glenn in particular. But we're also going to see the first flights of the Blue Moon Mark I lander and also Blue Ring, their spacecraft and orbital transfer vehicle. So they've got more things going. They're going faster. It's just how will that compare to SpaceX, which just is, lapping the field by several laps, really, in terms of just how quickly they're going with Falcon launches.
Jason, do you want to talk at all about Amazon Leo, or Sandra, do you want to talk at all about Blue Ring there?
I don't have a lot to add to what Jeff said, but yeah, Blue Ring is a big deal because it's a mobility vehicle. So it would take Blue Origin beyond just being a launch provider to being more of a player in how the Space Force deploys satellites and deploys payloads. If they can successfully develop this Blue Ring vehicle, it could be a significant player in national security space. They're supposed to launch next year, and it's been partly funded by the Department of Defense. So there's a lot of expectations there on how it would play a role in what the Space Force calls dynamic space operations, being able to maneuver, being able to send a vehicle like Blue Ring to potentially examine other objects, potentially help defend a satellite from an aggressor and whatnot. So the applications could be very numerous.
And the Space Force is also watching New Glenn very carefully because they
Yes.
Are considering that for national security launches.
Yeah,
as well.
it's already met the requirement of 2 launches to be certified. So now they have to review all the data, and that could take months. We don't know, but they have put out a statement saying they're very excited about New Glenn having completed 2 launches, and now it's just a question of how long these reviews will take and get the certification so they can start launching national security missions. And that could happen next year. We don't know.
Jason, how about on the Amazon Leo side?
Sure, yeah, I can just add that deployments for Amazon Leo are underway, but launch is still a critical part of that story and how that constellation shapes out. They have contracted many rockets, but they're heavily relying on rockets that have yet to really prove themselves at scale. And so that's the biggest thing to watch out for in terms of how they're going to progress next year.
Jason, I have another question for you here. Actually, I got a couple quick ones, but where in your view is the emerging D2D industry heading? In 5 to 10 years, do you see it being a duopoly shared by Starlink and AST SpaceMobile, or do you see legacy providers or new entrants
Oof.
successfully entering the industry? That's not a quick one. I lied.
Yeah, I was gonna say that would be tough. Yeah, it's a key question, and it's one I ask a lot, because it is still very early days. But depending on who you talk to, this D2D, direct to device, is an incredibly expansive opportunity for the space industry. It truly makes it mass market, as it were. And you'd think because of the economies of scale and just how far ahead companies like SpaceX are with this capability, that is going to be dominated by them. But the people I speak to still, they see this ongoing need for alternatives. They point to how, usually a country has at least two mobile operators operating there. And I'd say that although, SpaceX is going all out to capture this market, the case for multiple players is increasing. It's interesting they mentioned Starlink and AST because both of those are based in the US. And then AST has this plan for a joint venture in Europe to help expand over there. But is that enough to address this rising need for sovereign capability? Not just in Europe, but just everywhere really. Would they still be linked to US regulations and influence? Because D2D it's incredibly sensitive. It's an incredibly sensitive capability if you think about it. These companies are, in people's pockets. So that's a big question mark for me. And then don't forget about China, of course. They got two mega constellations underway, and they have a powerful terrestrial mobile ecosystem that many countries already rely on. Uh, I think next year we'll get more clarity on how that all shakes out. We still need to see really what AST's constellation can do and how much consumers care about that, I think.
Um, Thank you. And now let me ask, one other quick SATCOM question here, which is, what are your thoughts on the potential Globalstar sale? What's the rationale for buying the company? And who would you see as potential suitors?
So firstly, I'd say these kind of rumors are not new for Globalstar. It comes up now and then. But with SpaceX pushing hard for D2D and the kind of satellite spectrum that Globalstar has, certainly seems more timely. The rationale is companies that started off the plan to provide D2D with cellular frequencies from telco partners no longer see that as enough, really. AST are doing the same thing. You could argue Link Global is as well. Uh, Spectrum is the lifeblood of connectivity. The more you have, the more service you can provide, the better service you can provide. Question is, how much bandwidth is truly important for D2D? We don't really know yet. Yeah, but SpaceX and Globalstar have a history, and there is work on compatibility between them, which supports a potential deal. I saw rumors of the $10 billion price tag, so that's something SpaceX can definitely do. In terms of other suitors, there's Apple itself, although I'm not sure whether I think it's unclear how many iPhones it has managed to sell just because of the satellite connectivity that they have with Globalstar. But again, it's early days. A telco, although their AT&T and Verizon have already kind of sided with AST, but that's not exactly exclusive. I mean, it's Google, but Amazon, what's Amazon's direct-to-device play? They seem pretty aligned with SpaceX in pretty much everything else. So that would be interesting to watch out for. I don't have any proprietary information to share, but it's something I'm certainly looking out for.
Sandra, I have a question for you here. This is from Jeff Janisic at InnoFlight, but I'm not going to read the whole question, but essentially what he asks is, how are the U.S. government and national systems in space moving fast in light of the continued and always evolving cyber threat? Meaning, how can space avoid becoming overly vulnerable, and how can you move fast at a time when cyber threats seem to be moving even faster? And I hope I'm paraphrasing that correctly, Jeff.
Yeah, I mean that's kind of the issue that applies pretty much to every military space program. And we don't necessarily know what cyber attacks are taking place. They don't tell us, and even commercial companies don't share that. Occasionally that it gets published in the media that somebody was hacked, but it's not something that companies want to volunteer. So I think it's just a question of how can they design systems so they can be flexible enough to adapt to different threats. And I think we're seeing that with some of the newer architectures that some commercial companies say we have to design cybersecurity from the beginning as kind of as a built-in requirement as opposed to an afterthought, which kind of has been the trend up until now, because of the cost of complying with cybersecurity protocols can be very costly, and so companies want to minimize that cost. So I guess it's just going to be a little bit of a transition as to how the newer architectures are going to be designed to be more adaptable to threats. And in the meantime, you're going to see government programs. They have to comply with the Department of Defense rules on cybersecurity. They have very strict standards. And then you're going to see commercial pretty much doing, whatever they can to protect their systems, not just to comply with government requirements, but also because of the financial implications of being cyber attacked, which could be significant for a commercial operator.
I have one more question I'm going to take. This is from Gary Napier at Lockheed Martin, and he asked, how's the paywall going? And the short answer is it's going well. We have more and more readers, more and more organizations every week who are signing up and paying for Space News reporting. We've already made some changes to our offerings. All our subscriptions now include our digital monthly magazine, and we offer discounts for academic, government, and military readers. 2026 is obviously going to be a big year for us there. We're going to bring some new things online that we think will make us, hopefully even more indispensable. And so I would just say stay tuned. And we want to make Space News as valuable for you as possible. I have a few housekeeping things as we wrap up here. We're out of time, but like I said when we started, look for these type of events to become a semi-regular benefit for you as part of your Space News subscription in the new year. Thanks to everyone who's sending questions. We had a lot, and I thought this was a lot of fun, and it's always great to get the team together and hear about what they're thinking hard about. We're able to do all of this because of your investment in our team. And thanks to your support, we launched a number of new products and initiatives this year that I'd quickly like to highlight before we go. We've doubled our number of newsletters, including Andrew Jones' biweekly China report, our new Golden Dome series that's fueled by Sandra's great reporting, and our new Europe Report newsletter, which we just launched last month. You can sign up for all of them or any of them at spacenews.com/newsletters. Jason's latest Space News intelligence briefing was just published yesterday. It's the second in a series that started with a deep dive on SpaceX's launch business. This one is about how Starlink is changing the space economy. We've gotten great feedback from readers about the breadth and utility of these reports, and they're meaty. We hope you'll spend some time with them. They're both available right now at spacenews.com/intelligence. And we want to hear from you about the company's topics and trends we should explore next. Beyond the newsroom, Space News offers more and more opportunities to support your organization's goals and amplify success across the industry. If you're looking to hire, our job board can connect you with qualified Space News readers. Through our Stellar Dispatch press release service, you can post your latest announcements on spacenews.com and get it in front of your next client or potential investor. We've got a lot planned for the next year to help industry achieve the headlines you'll read about in Space News for years to come. So you can also start a conversation with our sales team. Lastly, if you value Space News in our coverage, we're confident there are others in your organization that would benefit from access as well. We can help upgrade an individual subscription to a multi-user group subscription for 500, or 5,000 seats. It's easy and affordable. You can start a conversation directly with our team at support@spacenews.com. That's all for now. Thanks again so much for joining us. Thanks for subscribing. We'll share a recording of our conversation with all of you later today. Keep reading Space News, and thanks again.